that I know the acoustics is very good. Here's June. Hi, June.
Plenty of room tonight, looks like, so we're good.
Welcome to the monthly program of the Rhinebeck Historical Society. My name's Mike Frazier. I'm the archivist with the Historical Society, and our program tonight is about the history of the Methodist Church, or churches, here in Rhinebeck. Before I introduce our speaker, Marilyn Hatch, I'd just like to mention that we have a Christmas party coming up December 14th at 6 o'clock at the Rhinecliff Hotel. If anybody is interested and hasn't signed up for that, let me know. It's $10 a person. January 22nd, I believe, is that the date, David, of our next? The last Friday in January will be our next program. That will be at the lower level of the Star Library at 7:30, and that will be Stephen Mann talking about the history of the Quakers here in Rhinebeck. And then the following month, the last Friday of the month, Mike Frazier will be talking about the Teal Map collection. So I look forward to both of those programs, and I hope some of you will be able to come to those. Now I'd like to introduce Marilyn Hatch. Rhinebeck has been known far and wide as a community that's not only has a lot of history, but that has been very serious about preserving that history. And a lot of the credit for that goes to our speaker tonight. There would not be a 1798 Quitman House that today houses the Museum of Rhinebeck History and the Quitman Resource Center were it not for the work done by Marilyn and her husband John. There would not be a 1727 Palatine farmstead here in town were it not for Marilyn's work. A lot of the early work that was done by the Rhinebeck Historical Society is work that was done by Marilyn. The Museum of Rhinebeck History is there largely because of efforts originating with Marilyn. One of the organizations that I haven't mentioned that Marilyn has devoted a lot of time to is the Methodist Church. And rather than try to summarize what she's done for the church, I'm going to turn the program over to the person who, more than anybody else, is responsible for the preeminence of history in the town of Rhinebeck, Marilyn Hatch.
You can't really start the history about the Rhinebeck Methodism without talking about Freeborn Gerritsen. And I realized as I was reviewing this information about him, he was really a contemporary with Reverend Quitman. I mean, he was just talking about the Quitman House. The Quitman House is named after Reverend Quitman, and Freeborn was here in the same time period as Freeborn Gerritsen. So there were really two great ministers that were here. Reverend Scott came a little later. I'm not sure you've all been to the Reformed Church and you know who was there in the Reformed Church. I don't know who was there at that time, but those were the early churches. So Freeborn, his mother's maiden name was Freeborn. There you have your answer. Who asked that question? How did Freeborn get his name? Somebody asked me that question. Oh, okay. So his mother's maiden name was Freeborn, and the Gerritsen is a derivative of Gerrit, G-E-R-E-R-T, from Holland. So how it got from Gerrit to Gerrit's son, maybe it was Gerrit's son who came from, pardon?
Son of Garrett.
Son of Garrett, right. Came from Holland. They settled in Maryland. Freeborn was born in 1752. When he was 10 years of age, his mother and his oldest sister died. It sounds like some kind of disease happened at that time. The history doesn't tell. And his father was a very moral man. They were members of the Church of England, had good moral character, and were Christians. When Freeborn was 21, his father died, and which allowed him to inherit some of his father's property. Now, I tell you that sounds very insignificant, but that inheritance, we'll talk about that a little later, but it provides for Freeborn really for all of his life. At 19 years of age, he came under the influence of Robert Strawbridge, who was an itinerant pastor from Ireland. I was at a conference down in Maryland, must be 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, and there is the Strawbridge Shrine down in Maryland commemorating Mr. Strawbridge. It's not that he really Freeborn heard him speaking, but he met with him and he talked with him and was the first influence of Methodism in his life, and was an itinerant Methodist preacher, as all the preachers were back at that time. We still have itinerant preachers. Our own pastor was an itinerant preacher until about 4 or 5 years ago. At age 27, when he heard Joseph Pilmore, a missionary from England, that he found the faith he had been seeking. He did not find it in the Church of England, and when he heard Fillmore, he really felt that his heart was strangely tugged. When he was 29, he met Francis Asbury. And how many of you have ever heard of Francis Asbury? Methodists have, few, yes. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Francis, but he was a missionary from England. He studied under John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism in England. And Freeborn had a conversion experience in June of 1775, right at the dawning of the Revolutionary War. That happened on a Saturday. On Sunday morning, he was in the habit of bringing all of his family together and preaching to them and having a morning worship. And all of a sudden, as he was looking at his slaves, he felt that it was not, all of a sudden, like somebody was talking to him, it is not right for you to keep your fellow creatures in bondage. You must let the oppressed go free. And at that moment, he told his slaves that how he felt, and that they would, for their work, they would be compensated. That they were no longer his slaves. So that's interesting that because Reverend Quitman did the same thing. He brought his slaves from Curacao and felt really tugged that he needed to free his slaves. Freeborn, the Methodists were organized in societies. They really had no formal churches, and what they did was they went around to different homes. And he opened his home, and his brother, John, opened their home for Methodist worship. It wasn't until 10 years later, in 1785, he was 33 years of age, that he was willing to leave my all and go out to be an itinerant preacher. Up to that point, he was willing to be a preacher. He wasn't ordained, but was at least a pastor. And all of a sudden, he just realized that that's what he needed to do. During the war years, all of the missionaries except Francis Asbury returned to England. They were accused of being Tories. They feared for their life. Some had to escape. Some went early. Some, escaped. Francis Asbury was the only one, and he hid out in one of his parishioners' house. In fact, the parishioner was jailed for a period of time, but still did not tell that Francis Asbury was in his home. One thing that you had to do when, back at that time, you had to take an oath of allegiance to your country. And if you did not take this oath of allegiance, you were really accused of being a sympathizer to the English. We had that same situation here in Rhinebeck. I can't help but compare the two, but at the Palatine Farmstead, Ludwig Elseffer would not, he absolutely refused to take an oath of allegiance to his country because he felt religiously his only oath that he could take was to his God. Yet he served his country, and he had a 6-month period of time when he served in the Revolutionary War with George Washington. 6 years was the magic, 6 months was the magic number because that's what you enlisted for at that time, was for 6 months. Garretson was, because he didn't take this oath of allegiance, Garretson was fined, he was jailed, he was assaulted by a judge who met him on the highway and who took up a rod and hit him over the head with a large stick. He was persecuted, and all of this really went on no matter where he was in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, wherever he traveled. He was always fearful of being accused of being Tories, being thrown in jail, until the war was over in 1781. In 1781, he traveled 5,000 miles and preached 500 sermons. It seems like a lot. And that was before he even came to New York. When he came to New York, he had clear from Long Island, New York City, clear up to the Canadian border, over to Connecticut, and to Schenectady. So all along the Hudson River Valley, that's what he traveled, and he traveled that every 3 months. So he was on his horse a lot. His saddlebags are at our conference headquarters, and they are in our archive department down there. By 1784, he had really emerged as a leader of American Methodism and was ordained. By 1785, he was sent as a missionary to Nova Scotia. 1788, he was assigned to New England, which was sort of fortuitous. He arrived in New York City at St. John's Church and realized that there was this real need for a missionary in the Hudson River Valley. And his friend from Maryland, Thomas Tillotson. How many of you know of Thomas Tillotson? What was he in the Revolutionary War? Does anybody know? Yes, Surgeon General to Washington. He had invited Garretson to come and visit. Now, it's interesting, our history books, and how sometimes what they say may not be true. Do you find that? Yes. And I always like to see primary documentation. Anyhow, when he arrived in Poughkeepsie and then came on up the post road and turned off to Thomas Tillotson's home, Linwood, but he went to Grassmere. So, I'm just wondering if the historians at that time got a little confused as to where Linwood was and where Grassmere was and who belonged to Grassmere and who belonged to, because it says that he married Gertrude. Well, no, he didn't marry Gertrude. He married Catherine, Gertrude's sister. So,
They got it wrong.
they got it wrong for some reason or other. It's very hard if you're doing primary.
It's all in the same family.
It's all in the same family. And Janet owned Grassmere at that time, and I thought, well, maybe the Tillotsons were staying with Janet at that time. Who really knows whether he went to Grassmere or whether he turned down Fishing Flats Road. Do you remember Fishing Flats Road? It's now called Fishing Grounds Road. Okay, it's now called Mill Road South or something like that. I was very disappointed when I drove by and saw.
Here in 1959. Yeah, and then it became, well, it's on its third name now.
Right, right. So, he was 36 years of age when he came to Rhinebeck. And he was invited to stay several weeks. And of course, he immediately started preaching. In the book, it said that he probably preached in the barn at Linwood. So that makes me wonder whether, whoever, Morris, who wrote this history, really was confused as to both places. Who knows? At this time, he met Catherine Livingston, who was the second daughter of Margaret and Judge Robert Livingston. She was about 36 years of age also. Of course, a sister of Gertrude and of Janet. Janet was the first daughter. And I want to make a connection there with Gertrude and Janet and Richard Montgomery. Tomorrow, there's a program at the DAR house, and myself and a Revolutionary War reenactor gives the love story of Janet and Richard. Of course, their courtship was short, their marriage was short, also 2 years, and before he was killed in the Battle of Quebec. His last words in his last letter to Janet was, "Remember me to GT." Okay? So it can only be Gertrude Tillotson, in my mind. But I'm not going to write that down. Somebody may find that there's another GT around. Because the Methodists met in people's homes, one of the homes, and there is a marker, is the Benner House over here on Mill Street, which is right across, I shouldn't say, right behind Hobson's TV. It's the Stone House, and there is a state marker that says that it was an early meeting place for the Methodist church, Methodist congregation, Methodist societies, actually. Catherine was one of the first to join, and she through her 4 or 5 year courtship or her acquaintance with Freeborn, fell very much in love with him. She was 41 years of age, and her parents wouldn't give her permission to marry Freeborn. Okay, at 41 years of age, you know, that's, her brother said, and I had to quote this, "Catherine, enjoy your religion here at home all you please, but for heaven's sakes, don't join those Methodists. Why, down at the ferry, nobody belongs to them, only 3 fishermen and a Negro." Her reply, "Well, what if, as you say now, nobody belongs to the Methodists? I will join them. Then you will say somebody does." I guess she told her brother. Actually, it was her mother that was won over and finally relented, and Freeborn and Catherine had decided they were going to get married no matter what her parents said, one way or another. But right before they did get married in June of 93, her mother relented, realized that her daughter was resolute and that she wanted her daughter to be happy. So at 41 years of age, she gave her consent. This brings in the very first church, Methodist church, and it was on the Salisbury Turnpike. Do you all know where Salisbury Turnpike is? You're going out 308 and you go off to the right. Where it is, it's not marked, and I have no idea where it was, except that it's where they were married, and it's where they lived really, except for 1 year. Soon after they were married, Freeborn was assigned to Philadelphia, and Catherine went with him to Philadelphia. There was a yellow fever outbreak, and she stayed right there with him and nursed and cared for the people who were sick while other people from Philadelphia were escaping into the country. They came back. They lived there for 5 years, at what time their daughter Mary was born. Mary was their only child. There was the slate quarry, and I don't know where the slate quarry was. Does anybody really know where the slate quarry was? I mean, Slate Quarry Road, but do you know where the quarry was? I thought maybe somebody would know and would be able to tell us. But anyhow, there were workers there from Wales. And there was this one woman who was married to one of the workmen there, and she would every Sunday morning walk from Slate Quarry over to Salisbury Turnpike and attend church. She had a young daughter. Her name was Maria James, and Maria must have been very close to Mary's age, because Catherine made a very unusual request. Her daughter was lonely. She wanted a playmate for her daughter, and she asked Mrs. James if she would allow her daughter Maria to come and live with them, and that she would provide for her daughter and give her an education. And she agreed to that arrangement. Maria was really a servant in the, people looked at her as a servant in the Gerritsen household. But she was very well educated, and at some time in her life, she started writing poetry. If you go on Google Books, and you Google in Maria James, you will see her 175-page book of poetry with 32 pages of forward notes on her poetry. Now, it's very interesting because there was a collection taken up by some of the river folk to have her book of poems published. And there were those people along the river thought it was just, I mean, why would you publish poetry written by a servant woman? And so there were many, many, many people who were outraged that this had taken place. There in Poughkeepsie, there was a Reverend Potter, and Reverend Potter wife paid a visit, and I wish I could find it. I went to look for her letter, and I've looked, and I thought, oh, for sure, I know now where it is, and I looked, and could not find it. I've been for a month looking for this letter that she wrote, really in support of Maria James. And she's visits Catherine Gerritsen and her daughter Mary at their Wildercliff home on Mill Road, and meets Maria James and talks about how intelligent she was and what a fine young woman Maria was. So, and she then sends this letter out to the river folk. In other words, saying, you know, you really don't know what you're talking about. But if you go on Google Books and type in Maria James, you can either download her 175 pages or you can read them. But her poems were quite religious in nature. I'm going to leave that church for a little bit that was on the Salisbury Turnpike and go to 1799, when Freeborn purchases a lot along the river. It was called Wildercliff because there was on the cliff, there was a Indian carved into this huge rock. In fact, when Daisy Sookley was still alive, she took myself and the Boy Scouts down there and showed us the Indian etching on this rock. And so that's why it was called Wilder, after the Indian drawing on this rock. And Wilderstein sort of was a takeoff from that. But he purchased and had built his humble home there at Wildercliff by 1799. The Quitman House was built in 1798, so it's, again, contemporary. Francis Asbury, who visited there many times after Revolutionary War, called it the Traveler's Rest. It was very unpretentious, but very, very comfortable. Do you all know where Wildercliff is? Okay. Now, coming back to the second church in 1801, and that's this deed right here. Janet Livingston Montgomery gives a plot of land over here on Center Street, had to be on the east side of Center Street, for a church. And one thing, if you have time, I'm not going to pass it around because it's too bulky and too heavy to do that. But you'll notice Janet Montgomery's signature over here on the right-hand side. Over here is her agent, John Cox. Remember, she was of a period of time when women really weren't allowed to own and sell land, although she was a top-notch realtor. She really was. She was buying and selling property all the time. And John Cox was her agent. So just if you want to know who John Cox is, but his signature is over there. They took the church down on Salisbury Turnpike, brought it probably by horse and wagon, and put it up here on Center Street in 1801. It wasn't too long when the congregation had outgrown the church. It was Daniel McCarty who took the church down and rebuilt it over here. Now, Daniel McCarty, his home was it used to be Mrs. Decker's. It used to be the yellow, and they've painted it with white again, on the corner of Parsonage and Market Street, right across from the deli. Can you visualize that? Now, his son, Stephen, was a joiner. Do you know what a joiner is? Actually, a carpenter who did all of the finishing work. And Stephen was the carpenter who did the Reformed Church when it was rebuilt, and he did the steeple and the entrance of the Lutheran Church. But Daniel, the significance of Daniel is that he marched north to Canada with General Montgomery. And the only reason he never made it to Quebec was because he was assigned to bring General Schuyler. General Schuyler became very, very ill, and he accompanied Schuyler back to Albany. And so when everything was going wrong up in Quebec, Daniel McCarty was back here. On March 3rd, knowing that the congregation had gotten so large, the trustees decided that it was time to build a larger building. Whether they didn't have enough land over there or whatever, but Janet, again, steps forward and gives them a 1/2 acre facing the turnpike. So what we call Market Street was actually the beginning of Salisbury Turnpike. In fact, I'm not too sure where the toll gate was, but it was right outside of town. And I don't know exactly where it is, but I assume that it was close to where Wonderland is. It was to be 45 feet wide and 55 feet long from outside to outside. The cornerstone was laid by Freeborn Garretson May 1st, 1822, and completed on the 6th of October. The cost of the building was $3,559.88. And this is the building. Okay, this is what it looked like. One thing that I had always some confusion about was there was this freeborn Garretson Jr. And I knew that the Garretson only had one daughter, one child, and it was a daughter. And so I was wondering who this freeborn Garretson Jr. was. But freeborn Garretson was Freeborn's nephew, and he had come from Maryland to live here in Rhinebeck. And he was a real leader here in this church, and was instrumental in the building of, he was secretary as this church was being built. In 1823, the Cemetery Association was formed, and the burials were behind the church. In 1827, at 75 years of age, Freeborn was still traveling the circuit. And he left for New York in August, and he stayed at the home of George Suckley. Now, who knows who George Suckley was? Go ahead, June.
Well, he was the first Suckley to come over from England,
Right,
and he was Robert's grandfather.
absolutely. And he was a staunch Methodist. And so Freeborn was at George Suckley's home. He became acutely ill, and by September the 26th, 1827, he died. Was brought up here and buried in the cemetery back here. Throughout his ministry, he never accepted a salary. Now, I told you that he had inherited his father's, okay? That estate allowed him to sustain himself. So if somebody paid him something, he gave it either to a person in need, to the church, or to charity. But he never, ever accepted a salary. Now, Catherine has inherited from her grandfather and from her mother, and Catherine is well-to-do in her own right. Okay. He served as an itinerant pastor for 52 years. There was a parsonage. I don't know where the parsonage was located, but there was a parsonage for the minister who was serving this church. But in November 12th, 1829, a deed for 1 rod and 13 perches at the rear of the church lot was given to the church for the building of the parsonage. For our pastor and his wife, that was the back section of the now parsonage, okay? So it was that back section that was built in 1829. And it's interesting, this is another historic fact. Honorable Edward Livingston had in his possession, by the will of his sister Janet Montgomery, some of this property, and which I thought was sort of interesting because it really indicates that he came in possession of the land within the village from his sister Janet Montgomery. And I don't know. I have no way except you probably have a deed there at the Reformed Church stating that. But the parsonage was built for $1,305.79. In 1832, the Catherine Garretson presented the church with a half an acre of land for the burying ground south of the village. Now that is the Rhinebeck Cemetery. And in the Rhinebeck Cemetery is a plot that was given for the Methodist. And bodies were interned from here and taken there. It's all because the village that year had passed an ordinance saying that no more burials would happen in the village of Rhinebeck. And so thus the Rhinebeck Cemetery as we know it today. The church was given this property on one condition, that it would surround that plot with a good fence and no more interments at the church. Now, if you read the historical marker out there, it says that both Catherine and Freeborn are buried here, okay? Well, if you read, you go behind the church sometime, you're welcome to come and walk behind the church. And there's 2 plaques that have been put on the back of the church. And one indeed is Freeborn Garretson. And I'll read to you in just a minute what it says about him. And the other one is Catherine Suckley. So again, you can't, some historian didn't go back and read the plaque. But it's Freeborn and Catherine that are memorialized with plaques back there. And the reason why Catherine Garretson isn't back there is because she couldn't be buried back there, because she died at the ripe old age of 97. So she lived long after Freeborn died. He died when he was 75. We have an artifact up here. In 1851, the year before, this church had fallen into debt, and they went to George Suckley, and George Suckley gave him $1,000 to get him out of debt. And he said, you cannot get yourself in debt again. And to make sure you don't, before you make any expenditure, you have to ask me, okay? So in 1851, they wanted to put a bell in the tower in the 1822 church. It's going to cost them $200. So they went to George Suckley and said, hey, we want to put a bell in the tower. It's going to cost us $200. We need your permission to take out a loan to do that. And he said, no, you can't do that. Here's $50. So with $50 in hand, they went ahead and ordered a bell. And so now do you know what this is from? It's from the bell, okay? Sort of a, I have a feeling that this is maybe the top, and because when the church burned, it was so hot that it disintegrated, whatever happened to it. In 1868, they receive a gift from Mary Garretson of the property right across on the other side of the drive for the parish hall. It was the Sunday school building for the church. And in 1871, the front part of the parsonage was built. So that's sort of the chronology of this church until 1899. And this was what the church looked like February 1899. And while that's being passed around, I'm going to read to you. The following is an account written on February 15th, 1900 by the Reverend Stephen F. White, pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church of Rhinebeck, New York, telling of the fire and the rebuilding of the building of its present edifice. In the early morning of February 12, 1899, about 2 a.m., the historic old church, founded by Freeborn Garretson, and under the pulpit of which he was buried, was utterly destroyed by fire. The fire is supposed to have originated in a defective flue, the weather being very cold and a hot fire having been kept up by the sexton all the previous day. The study attached to the church, with its valuable library and the pastor's private library, were lost at the same time. The pastor at once called the official board together, and a building committee was appointed consisting of Pastor P.F. Radcliffe, Cotting, Carroll, Clearwater, Cookingham, many of our town fathers' names. Many meetings were held by this committee and architects and plans considered. Finally, the contract for erecting the new church edifice was awarded to Ackert and Brown, two local builders. And the work of demolishing the old walls was begun on Saturday, June 10th, 1899. And now I'm going to turn to this book by Morris, and this is a primary source for this 1822. A well was dug, the accommodation of the building for the first step. It afforded a full supply of water for all the purpose of making mortar and every other necessary as long as it was wanted, and not many days after we ceased to use it, the well became dry. Another circumstance in digging of the well is also deemed worthy of note. After excavating the earth a short distance, we presently discovered an excellent vein of loam, and in going a little deeper, found another of sand, and still going a little deeper, found another of gravel, which answered all the purposes for erecting the stone building, in making mortar for the wall, for the plastering, and for the rough casting of the building upon the outside. This was fortunate to us, which saved us much trouble and expense. Sacred to the memory of Reverend Freeborn Garretson, an itinerant minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church. He commenced his itinerant ministry in the year 1775. In this work he continued until his death, laboring with great diligence and success in the various parts of the United States and Nova Scotia. He died in peace in the city of New York, September 27, 1827, in the 76th year of his age and the 52nd year of his ministry. In a letter written after his death, Mrs. Garretson gave an intimate portrait of her husband. Concerning material possessions, she wrote, "He was economical from principle and always tried to instill into his family and those whom over he had influenced the right use of money. He gave what he could and never laid up 1 cent of income. With a small property, he has done more than many in 10 times his means. With regard to himself, I always thought him too sparing and often urged him to be more personal, like liberality. If he had been a man of the world, he would have become very rich." I need to make a few more comments. Any comments about this church? I think it's unique that it was built in 1900, that the light fixtures were electric as well as gas. The fixtures all the way around here are gas. If you notice that you're sitting in pews that are arched, which sort of brings the congregation into the center. The outstanding feature are the artificial pipes. They are not real, they're just decorative. The organ was a pipe organ, and that was behind. It's now an electronic organ, and that's behind those pipes also. But they're beautiful. When they put in the new organ, they took those pipes down and cleaned them, and it was just remarkable how they had a coal-burning stove here and how dirty they had become. I saw a document today when I was looking through. In fact, it's this document. It was called, the Rhinecliff Church was called Rhinecliff Station. I have no idea when it was called Rhinecliff Station, but it was known as the Rhinecliff Church. These are pictures here of Freeborn Garretson, his wife Catherine, and Mary. There's two pictures of Catherine. If you want to, when you leave, you can take a look at them. But in 1855, need arose in Rhinecliff and in Hillside. Hillside is south of Rhinebeck. Hillside Church was built. It grew out of a Sunday school program that was taught by Julia Lynch Olin. She was the granddaughter of Thomas Tillotson, okay? And her sister. There were lots of children in the area, and she felt that there needed to be a Sunday school. And she particularly loved, there's a glen. Glenburn is called Glenburn. There's a beautiful glen with a bridge. There are two benches, stone benches, large benches carved into the side. And that's where they held their Sunday school program. And so in memory of Julia, the students, the congregation grew from that Sunday school, decided to build this sweet little church, and in 1855. It had quite a congregation, was really very important to that community until, the car became available and you could go to whatever church you wanted to go to. The plaque in memory of Julia Olin is in the back. 1859, the Rhinecliff Methodist Episcopal Church was built, and this is the church and this is the parsonage. It just wasn't working, and the congregation kept diminishing. When Reverend Hilton was our minister here, the Rhinecliff Church merged January 6, 1972. This is the Mount Rutson Church. In 1971, when George Suckley died, he left a plot of land that's now called Fernwood Forest, and he left that to the annual conference, New York Annual Conference, Methodist Conference. And for a retirement village for Methodist ministers who had retired. A chapel was built, homes were built, and it was very, very successful for a while. If you want to pass that around and look at it.
But they didn't like it because it was too far from the village.
Absolutely. What was the other reason? Do you know?
I don't know, but I know that one.
Okay. They had one horse and carriage, and they could never agree who got the horse and carriage to come into the village. Right.
I know down the Suckley House there's a picture of it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
There in the library, right by the fireplace.
Now, how many of you remember DeWitt Grinnell?
Who doesn't?
Who doesn't? New people do not know who DeWitt Grinnell is. It was his mother who did that drawing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, when the retired Methodist ministers couldn't get along, they abandoned the place, and the property was sold to John Jacob Astor, and he took it back.
Mrs. Astor left all that property to Rhinebeck because, what's his name, remember, Staley?
Yes, Nick
He
Staley.
talked her into it.
Mm-hmm. Which is wonderful. It has been such a wonderful asset for Rhinebeck to have that.
Homer Staley.
Homer Staley.
Thank him.
Yes. Yes, the Rhinebeck Historical Society had a meeting where he came and talked. It was a wonderful program, and he was taped. Now, if we ever find those tapes again, you will have that wonderful history from Homer's Day.
Well, I heard him tell it at the bar after he went on.
Every evening,
Every year.
every evening,
Right.
There might have been a few details added that
every evening.
weren't able to be substantiated by primary sources.
Well, there was always the history of Rhinebeck, and then there was the history of Rhinebeck as told by DeWitt Grinnell also. So now you can add me to that list, don't I? This was written by a member of our church called Ted Hughes. Was very, very involved down at Wilderstein, was very involved in the Rhinebeck Historical Society, and was a member. And he wrote this book on Freeborn Garrison. And I mean, it's really primary documentation. So I feel that his booklet is fairly accurate.
Marilyn mentioned an omission earlier. She is the person who spearheaded the effort in 1979 to put over 300 properties in the
88.
village, 388 properties.
Actually, there were more. There were like,
What with them?
On the, there was a village historic district created that was National Registered District. And at the time, it was the largest such district in the United States. And it was a result of an enormous effort on Marilyn's part, and she had others helping her as well, to photograph those properties, describe those properties, make sure that the data was accurate. And actually, interestingly, in the last 12 months, with the assistance of an intern from SUNY Albany, that study has been updated, and all of it is now courtesy of work done by David Miller and a number of other folks, Steve Hubbard. It is now available on the web. If you, well, you can just search the Village of Rhinebeck Historic District, and all those properties, descriptions of those properties, photos of those properties are all available to the public, but it was, much of that is Marilyn's work. On top of that, 8 years later, you did the same thing for the town of Rhinebeck with the multi-resource district, and those records they're not on the web yet, but they are available at the Rhinebeck Historical Society, and they're a matter of public record. Krista Miller
yes. And I walked.
is the intern.
Was the intern. We walked around last winter. It was a wonderful winter to do this. Do you remember last winter? Mild, mild, wonderful to take pictures without snow on the ground. And so it was just perfect. The Lord knew that we needed to do this, and that Krista was available. And so that's how we got it updated. And as soon as we got it updated, the Nancy Todd from New York State Historic Preservation Office said, now are you ready to update the town of Rhinebeck multi-resource district? And I said, not quite. So if anybody's interested in doing that, I'd show them how to do it. But I think I've had it for a while.
Going back to 1899 and the fire that took place that tore down everything except the outer walls of the earlier church, that took place in February, and lest anybody think the Rhinebeck Fire Department was not doing its job, you need to realize that the way you fought fires in those days was that you had to get an axe and chop a hole in the ground to get access to the cistern. Then you put a hose into the water and had pumpers. Now, the difficulty in that particular February is that it was nasty, nasty cold, and had been for a good while, which actually was the reason that they were trying to get the fire to keep going intensely, but you couldn't break the ice. It was so thick, and you couldn't fight the fire, so the firemen had to watch the building disintegrate.
And people showed up for church on that Sunday morning to a church that had been burned out. And Rhinebeck is so neat throughout our history. When any disaster like that happened, I mean, the church met at the Star Library.
Yeah.
Okay, they just opened the doors and, you know, we were there. When the school burnt across the street, we opened the doors for the kids to have school here.
First and second.
Right. And so it's a wonderful, rich history of sharing and loving and caring. And I hope that it just goes on forever and ever, long after I'm gone. And I'm so pleased that everybody recognizes the historic significance of Rhinebeck. New people come in, they want to build terrible things here in Rhinebeck, and we've been really known to say, no, you really can't do that. It's not in our keeping to do that. And it's important for us to recognize and to perpetuate the memory of those who've come before us.
So I want to,
I'm
on
sure
behalf
I
of the
am
Historic
so
Society,
thirsty.
thank you for